Germany is one of the richest countries in the world, with one of the most prosperous people in the world. It ranks as the 19th most productive people, the 3rd wealthiest country overall, and the 7th most developed country in the world. So let's look at how Germany got there. Chapter 1. Early Germany. What we think of as Germany has existed for only 150 years. Before then, Germany was a collection of hundreds of smaller states, and those smaller states were largely combined into the Holy Roman Empire. Look at this map. This is a map of the Holy Roman Empire at the end of the 18th century. It controlled territory all the way from modern-day Poland to Belgium to Slovenia. The majority of the people living in this area were German, and these German states were connected via a series of rivers, such as the Rhine, the Weser, and the Elbe. Northern German cities like Hamburg became major trade hubs, trading the goods from upriver with people in other countries. As the cities at the mouth of the rivers became larger, they needed more goods to trade, and as a result, cities located upstream on the river began developing thanks to their trade with the coast. And the main trade partners for coastal cities were European colonial empires, in particular the Dutch, French, and British empires. Because those colonial empires needed manufactured goods. The reason they needed manufactured goods is because the way they made money off of their empire was through trade, such as spices with Asia, slaves with Africa, and sugar with America. Trade ships did not carry big bags of money to buy these products. No, they needed to trade for them, and they traded manufactured goods such as steel, guns, textile, cutlery, and much more. But those empires never had enough manufactured goods to buy all the things they wanted, and their solution to this problem was to import manufactured goods from other countries. And in the case of the Dutch, French, and British, the nearest place they could buy those goods were the German states. As a result, German industry prospered in the 17th and 18th century, and they got a reputation for producing high-quality steel products. Because the Holy Roman Empire consisted of hundreds of smaller states, there were also hundreds of potential states that could trade with the European empires. Those states began developing industries specifically designed to export. For example, the city of Solingen is located here, close to the river Rhine. This city became famous for the production of cutlery, and it was sold all over the European colonies, with Brazil being one of the main buyers of German cutlery. This trade was so successful that one of the first German companies was established here in 1731 called Zwilling. And they were so good at it that this company still sells cutlery to this very day. And because of the success of German industry, more and more Germans began working as craftspeople. All those craftspeople need food, and no matter how hard a blacksmith hits his iron, it won't turn into bread. With fewer farmers, the price of food went up, and German farmers began adopting new agricultural techniques to feed everyone. As a result, both the urban and rural workers benefited from trade with the European empires, and in the late 18th century, the German economy grew by about 0.1% per year, which was slower than Western Europe, but faster than almost anywhere in the world at the time. But this process came to an end at the early 19th century. That's because England had developed steam engines, and English steam engines allowed them to create factories that produced a lot more than a German workshop ever could. As the English produced more goods for themselves, they had to import fewer goods from other countries. At the same time, slavery was abolished, meaning that their trade with Africa mostly came to an end. So England needed to trade fewer goods while producing more goods, and the Germans simply couldn't compete. Instead, the Germans began buying English goods, and German industry transitioned away from trying to produce everything towards buying components from England, turning them into finished goods, and then selling that to other people. This strategy worked for a while, but then everything became worse when Napoleon conquered the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. Napoleon and England were enemies. To hurt the English economy, Napoleon decided that the German states were no longer allowed to trade with England. But German industry required English components. As a result, a lot of businesses went bankrupt. The Germans tried to buy components from other countries or making it themselves, but that would take several years to set up. And then something even worse happened. Napoleon was defeated. In the peace agreement that followed, the German states were once again allowed to trade with England, which meant that all that new industry they had been building to produce components immediately became useless. That's because now they could just buy those components from England again at a much lower price. So the German states first lost a lot of businesses producing finished products, and now they lost a lot of businesses producing component parts. And so now it's 1815. The German industry is doing terribly. Something had to change. Chapter 2. The German Confederation. After Napoleon was defeated, the German states were reorganized into the German Confederation, meaning that instead of having hundreds of German states, there were now just 39. This made trade much simpler, because if you wanted to trade in Germany under the Holy Roman Empire, you might have to travel through a dozen different states. In every state, you would have to show your wares to the customs agency and then pay a tax for transporting goods through their territory. This was incredibly expensive. But with fewer states, there were fewer custom checks and fewer taxes, making German trade easier and cheaper. One thing you will notice is that two states control a lot of territory. One is in the south, called Austria, the other in the west and east, called Prussia. And Prussia made a very important discovery in its eastern territories. There was a lot of coal and iron ore, and you can use that to create iron and steel. And in the 19th century, one of the most important products were iron and steel. But Prussia also had a big problem, because their territory was divided in two. In the east were the resources, and in the west were the financial centers, universities, and government. This meant that most of the iron and steel they produced in the east would be sent to the west. But in order to do that, they would have to travel through other German states, and those states wanted Prussia to pay a tax every time they passed through it. And so Prussia decided to set up the Prussian Customs Union in 1818. A customs union is a group of countries that all decide to reduce or remove taxes on trade between each member, similar to the European Union's customs union. The Prussian customs union, however, started out in just Prussia. That's because after the defeat of Napoleon, Prussia gained a lot of territory that used to be controlled by hundreds of different states. And each state demanded taxes from traders moving through their land, so Prussia decided to unite them all into a single tax and customs union for all goods traveling through Prussian territory. And if you want to sell a ship from Trier in the south to Wesel in the north, then you didn't have to pay a dozen taxes and didn't have to stop at a dozen borders. As a result, German businesses had more customers they could sell cheaper products to, and German industry began to flourish. Iron smelters, steel mills, workshops, textile factories, and much more began to pop up. The money they lost from lower taxes was easily offset by the new industry set up thanks to iron, coal, and free trade. This success meant that other states wanted to join as well, and in 1833 several German customs unions were combined into a single large customs union, called the Zollverein, which is simply the German word for customs union. Over time, the Zollverein expanded, and by the 1870s it included all the German states except Austria. And by the 1840s, the German economy had recovered from the economic crises caused by Napoleon and English competition. Some of that industry began producing tools and machinery to make farming and food production easier, allowing more people to move from farm work to factory work. But it also caused issues. You see, a farmer will only invest in producing more food if they can earn more money. But a lot of Germans lived under feudalism. What this meant for them is that they would work on the land owned by a lord. They would hand over most of the food to that lord, and in exchange they got a place to live. But because they didn't earn more money from producing more food, they had no incentive to invest in their farm. While most farmers did not live under feudalism, it still meant that much of the farmland wasn't being improved, and so it was decided to end feudalism across the German Confederacy in 1830. Farmers would now own the land they lived on, but they wouldn't get it for free. They would have to pay a mortgage to the landlord. This meant that farmers still had to pay a large sum of money to their landlord, and 2.5 million Germans simply packed up their stuff and moved to another country, mainly Switzerland and the USA. As the Zollverein gained more members, they also faced more competition from those other members. In order for businesses to survive, they began to specialize. So maybe you can't make every machine, so you just focus on making cotton spinning machines. The more factories focused on certain products, the more efficient they were to produce and the cheaper those products were to sell. Different states began focusing on different types of industry until every state produced just a small number of goods. The way these industries were set up is that they started by assembling finished goods, such as steam engines. Then they would set up a factory producing one component part. Once that was successful, they moved on to another factory producing another component part, until eventually each state could produce almost everything they needed to produce a couple of types of products within their borders. This was true for anything from glass to processed food to trains. Chapter 3. German Infrastructure. And speaking of trains, in the 19th century, new types of industries were invented. For thousands of years, the fastest form of transport was a horse or a sailing ship. But with industrialization came new types of transportation, and three of them were important for the German economy and German nationalism. Because I am Dutch, the first mode of transport we will discuss is canals. Before the Industrial Revolution, ships had to be dragged with men and horses through canals, but with the steam engine, ships could travel through canals on their own. This made trade a lot easier, and the German states began connecting the German rivers together with canals in the 1920s, connecting the Danube, Weser and Elbe rivers. It became possible for a ship to travel from Berlin all the way to the Rhine region without traveling via the sea. By 1846, 180 steamships traveled the German rivers and canals. The second innovation was the Macadam road. Up until now, building a road required skilled laborers carefully putting stones together to form a road. But the Macadam road was much easier to build. You dug out some ground, poured stones into it, then crushed the stones into small rocks and dust, and then filled it up with cement. Suddenly, roads could be built easily with a large amount of unskilled labor, and the Germans went on a road building spree. And lastly, are trains. Trains allow a large amount of goods to be transported quickly between two major centers of trade. As more states joined the Zollverein, more industry was built and more major centers of trade were created. While a country like Austria or the United Kingdom had a large capital with a couple of smaller cities, Germany was a collection of medium-sized cities. Each of these cities was a center of trade. As a result, rail lines could connect dozens of cities together to form an interconnected railroad going across Germany. The first German rail line was built in 1835, and 30 years later, the majority of the German Confederation's citizens were connected via rail. After the major cities were connected, the Germans moved towards bringing train lines to smaller cities, and lastly, inside cities with tram lines. As a result of these three infrastructure developments, the German Confederation's economy grew faster than those of almost any other region in the world. And by the 1860s, the average German was just as rich as the average French or British person, until they would eventually surpass everybody else in Europe. To give you just one example of how quickly the German Confederation developed, in 1837 the first telegraph line was created in the USA. Just 15 years later, the German Confederation had the third longest system of telegraph lines in the world, only surpassed by the UK and USA. These telegraph lines were set up by a Prussian company you might have heard of called Siemens. The Germans were so good at making telegraph lines that they exported it to Austria and Russia, setting up much of the Austrian, German and Russian telegraph systems. And if you look at this map on screen right now, you will see the major telegraph lines in 1891. These were the cables that could carry the most information. And you will notice that if Western Europe wanted to communicate with Eastern Europe, the best way to do so was via Germany. The Siemens company still exists today, operating in anything from infrastructure to financial services. Chapter 4. German Unification. Telegraphs, steam engines, steel mills, these were all invented in other countries and then Germany copied them. But if Germany was ever going to catch up with other countries, it would need to develop its own high-tech industries. And luckily for the Germans, they were quite well educated. Prussia had been the first country to have compulsory education for children between the ages of 5 to 14. But a high school education wasn't enough to learn high-tech skills, such as turning coal into tar and tar into paint. And so the German states began investing in technical high schools, universities and vocational schools in the 1850s. Those people developed new mining techniques, new types of steel, and new electrical devices. And German industry developed rapidly. Between 1820 to 1850, the German economy grew by 0.2 to 0.4% per year. But between 1851 to 1880, it grew between 0.6 to 1.1% per year, which was a lot at the time. And the German population doubled in size in that same period. By the 1880s, German products were considered higher quality than those of almost any other country. But all that economic growth required money. Factories are expensive, but most people do not have enough money to build one. There are generally two solutions to this problem. The first is that the government gives you money to build a factory. This is how countries like Russia, Taiwan and Japan did it. But a lot of German states were so small they couldn't afford it. The second option is that you get a loan from a bank. Most German banks, however, were not very big. Some banks were only operating in one or a couple of states, and that meant that most loans were small and medium-sized loans used to create small and medium-sized enterprises. And this actually worked out really well for them. These smaller businesses were usually family businesses, and about 700 of these businesses created between 1850 to 1813 were so successful they still exist today, creating families of wealthy business people which inherited the wealth and knowledge. These family businesses would eventually grow to become leaders in their field in the 20th century, and these smaller businesses focused on producing specific products to sell to specific customers. So while countries like the UK or USA could mass produce a lot of products, the German states produced more high-tech and more niche products in general. That said, there were still several large German companies, however, not as many as other countries of a similar size. German industry became so successful that they needed more resources that they could buy. Some things could simply not be produced in Germany, such as sugarcane or cotton. Right next to the Zollverein was the Netherlands, and the Netherlands had colonies. So, in the 1850s, they signed a treaty with the Dutch. In the treaty, the Germans would buy raw materials from the Dutch colonies, the Dutch would buy German manufactured goods, and trade was made easier, creating a trade relationship between the Dutch and the Germans that lasts to this day. And in 1862, they also signed a free trade agreement with France. Germany, being located at the center of Europe, would become a trade hub between all the countries that surrounded it. And over time, they would sign more and more trade treaties with those other countries, until eventually by the 21st century, Germany had a free trade agreement with almost all European countries thanks to the European Union. Chapter 5. The German Empire. The German Confederacy became so powerful that they declared independence from Austria and united into a single country called the German Empire, or simply Germany. For details on German unification, we made a video about that too. I will put a link to it at the end of the video. German unification was unprecedented in human history. The combined economic and military power of the German Empire made it more powerful than any other country on the mainland of Europe. In order to unite, over the course of several years, the Germans had declared war on Denmark, Austria and France. A few years earlier, France, the UK and the Ottoman Empire went to war with Russia in the Crimean War, so Europe was becoming less peaceful. And when the world becomes less peaceful, countries start limiting foreign trade. Because if you rely on another country for vital goods, and then you go to war with that country, then you lose access to those goods. And so a lot of countries began putting up trade barriers, such as putting extra taxes on foreign products or only allowing a limited amount of foreign goods into the country. When other countries put up trade barriers, German industry had fewer customers to sell to. In order to protect German companies, the government decided to put up their own trade barriers as well. These barriers focused on industrial goods. So while there would be fewer customers in other countries, there would be less competition in Germany and thus more customers in Germany. But Germany focused too much on that industry. While Germany produced a lot of mining companies, steel mills, electrical equipment and chemical plants, it did not invest enough in agriculture, service sector or healthcare. And this hurt the German economy. Because while industry was valuable, so is food. And instead of making German farms more efficient so they could compete with other countries, Germany instead just limited foreign trade, with German farmers being one of the least productive among developed countries all the way up to World War II. As a result, more Germans moved into cities to work in factories. A lot of these factories were set up in Western Germany, and between 1871 to 1900, around 2.5 million Germans migrated from east to the west, starting a trend of German industry relying on immigrants. Chapter 6. A man, his mustache, and his mommy and daddy issues. In 1914, Europe erupted in World War I and spent the next 4 years blowing itself up. And in the end, Germany was on the losing side. And because they lost World War I, their territory was taken away. Germans who used to live in the German Empire were now living in Denmark, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France or Belgium. But a lot of them didn't want to be foreigners, packed up their stuff and moved to Germany, creating another migration wave looking for jobs. But this time, there weren't as many jobs. The reason for this is that a lot of businesses relied on trade with those former German territories. And if that German factory is now a Belgian factory, you need to pay a tax for trading with another country. So to give an example, let's say you are a German factory located in Munich. You used to buy components from this territory that now belongs to Belgium. But Belgium has export taxes, meaning you need to pay an extra tax for buying from that same factory. Your products are now more expensive. You then sell that product at Poznan, but that city is now part of Poland, so your more expensive product becomes even more expensive because the Polish government put an extra tax on it as well. A lot of German businesses couldn't compete anymore and simply went bankrupt. At the same time, Germany was also not allowed to trade with Austria and Hungary anymore, because they were allies during World War I. But historically, the Germans had done a lot of business with them, such as that telegraph line I mentioned a few chapters earlier, meaning all those roads, railroads and trade connections between the three countries became completely useless. Germany could have invested in new infrastructure, new factories and new industry, but that also wasn't possible, because during World War I, France and the UK had taken out loans to pay for that war. Those loans now had to be paid back, and they decided that Germany should pay reparations to France and the UK so that they could pay off their war debt. As products became less and less available, the price of each product increased. Eventually, the prices of all products became so high that Germany had 700% inflation in July 1922, meaning that the prices of products increased by 700% compared to a year earlier. Then, in the 1930s, the world faced the Great Depression, and businesses all over the world shut down. People all over the world were fired, and trade all over the world decreased. Germany was a broken country, becoming poorer and poorer every year, with no hope for the future. And when a government fails to solve problems for over a decade, that population usually becomes more right-wing and start voting for far-right parties. By 1934, Germany had gotten out of the Great Depression and was slowly increasing its wealth again. That's because when you're at the bottom, there is no other way to go but up. But this growth was incredibly unequal, with the people at the top, who were part of the new government, getting most of the benefits, while regular people were still becoming poorer and poorer. That's because the government limited how much people's wages were allowed to increase. So while prices were increasing, wages were not, meaning that each day Germans could buy fewer and fewer products, making them poorer. Instead of helping those people, the government invested in military industry. That industry was owned by the elites, meaning that during the regime, the rich benefited the most. And when World War II broke out, a lot of it was destroyed again as Germany lost another war. The government also began persecution campaigns against disabled people and various ethnic groups. But persecutions are expensive. You need camps, guards, trains and gas. And in the end, all that you achieve are dead people. The people getting killed and doing the killing could instead be doing something productive, such as making new stuff, building new homes, or just spending quality time with friends and family. From a purely economic perspective, you spend a lot of money to make your country less productive. Chapter 7. Occupation and Reconstruction. In 1910, the German Empire was 540,000 square kilometers in size, and another million square kilometers in the German colonies. In 1949, West Germany was just 250,000 square kilometers. The country had lost almost 5/6 of all its territory, and those Germans now living abroad were generally hated for starting World War II. This is a map from 1910. It shows where German people were in the majority, and a lot of those places are not part of Germany. And so, between 1944 to 1950, over 12 million Germans had their property taken away in order to repay for the war, and those people fled westward, mainly towards Germany and Austria, meaning that Germany once again had a large wave of immigrants looking for a job, a house and a new life. And for the sake of this video, we will only talk about West Germany and not East Germany. That's because this video is about how Germany became rich and East Germany never became rich. But with so much destruction and so many immigrants, who was going to pay for the reconstruction? Well, the German government decided that the rich should pay, because most rich people actually got even wealthier from the wars. And so they introduced a 2 to 3% tax over all wealth owned by the elites, which they would have to pay between 1952 to 1979. Next, Germany worked on improving its reputation. They removed hundreds of thousands of people from government jobs and put many of them into prison for participating with the wartime regime. But how do you prevent this ideology from coming back? Well, the far right generally relied on hatred towards certain groups. But the interesting thing is that those far right people almost never come into contact with the people they hate. That's because it's easy to hate someone you don't know anything about, and so the German government started a campaign to improve dialogue in the country. And in terms of economics, West Germany promoted all sorts of organizations which were forced to talk to other people. While dialogue was originally intended to change the political ideology of Germans, it also helped them to connect their society better economically. For example, trade federations and trade unions were promoted. Each industry generally had one large trade federation and one large trade union. They would negotiate on behalf of all industry in the case of trade federations and on behalf of all workers in the case of trade unions. And they would be encouraged by the government to cooperate collaborate, for example, creating education centers for new skilled workers. Because each state focused on different types of industry, it meant that those trade federations and trade unions could easily speak with the regional government to discuss workers' rights or new economic policies. But eventually these policies also helped to convince the French, British and US occupation forces that Germans could handle their own affairs, and a new country was created. Chapter 8. West Germany. After World War II, Germany focused heavily on small to medium-sized enterprises. These are generally businesses that have fewer than 500 employees and earn less than 50 million euro per day. While Germany has a couple of large companies such as Volkswagen or Adidas, it has focused mainly on small to medium-sized enterprises, because the more businesses you have, the more competition and innovation you get. And today, over 99% of all businesses are small to medium-sized enterprises, providing 58.5% of all jobs and accounting for 47% of the total economic output of the country. The way this generally works is that each region has a couple of large businesses which produce finished goods. For example, a car. A car needs hundreds of different components, so there are medium-sized businesses producing wheels, paint, headlights, and various other products. They in turn buy materials from small businesses such as rubber, chemicals, and electrodes. Each of those businesses becomes more and more specialized over time, producing products that were better and cheaper the more they focused on certain products, with each region focusing as many businesses related to one industry inside their own borders. But those industries cost money to build, so each region created support facilities ranging from investment agencies, customer service, and insurance companies, all focused on those specific industries. Thereby, West Germany created a patchwork of industrial hubs all over West Germany, connected via a high-quality infrastructure specialized for those industries. The different regions then traded the goods they produce with each other or with the outside world, and then they import everything they need that they couldn't produce themselves efficiently. To help facilitate West German exports, they established the European Coal and Steel Community, which promoted the trade of coal and steel between Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. This organization would eventually become the European Union. To give an example of why this was so useful, let's look at this part of Germany called the Ruhr. They mined coal to produce electricity for themselves and for export. They import iron and other metals via the Netherlands in order to create iron and steel. High-quality steel requires certain chemicals, so there is a chemical plant built just for that. They then transport those chemicals, steel and other materials south to Baden-Württemberg. There, companies like Mercedes, Porsche and Bosch turn them into car parts, vehicles and appliances. And from there they are exported all over the world. And because all of these small to medium-sized enterprises focus so much on trading with other regional businesses, it means that they can only grow if the entire industry grows. So if you sell chemicals, then the only way to grow as a business is if your customers need more chemicals. And that means you want to support policies that help grow those industries as a whole so that you can sell more of your products. And a lot of those smaller and medium-sized enterprises are leaders in their industries. But it's industries most people would never even think about. To give you an example, Schmidt AG is a German company that sells snowplows for airports. This market isn't very big, but it's a German company that is one of its leaders. And Germany has hundreds of companies like this, which are in the top 3 of their respective industries. But those industries in general are also smaller, just like their businesses operating in them. And as a result, they don't get the fame that a company like Toyota, Samsung or YouTube are getting. Germany instead is known for its high-quality labor, because one of the best ways to grow your economy is through skilled labor. As Rule of Acquisition number 74 states, knowledge equals profit. And Germany has created a rather unique education system which focuses a lot on hands-on experience. You see, a lot of people can't learn by sitting down in a classroom and listening to a professor telling them information. Some people need to work with their hands in order to learn new skills. But a lot of countries' education system focuses mostly on universities and theoretical knowledge. And while this is quite effective, it's excluding a large portion of the population who finds this type of learning very difficult. And so Germany focuses on vocational education, where people gain practical knowledge. The way this works is that students spend half the week in a classroom and half the week in a workplace at an apprenticeship. They both learn theoretical knowledge and practical experience. So, for example, an electrician needs to understand how electricity works. This requires a little bit of theoretical knowledge. You then go to the workplace where you actually get to work with electrical devices and see how electricity works in action. For a lot of people, this is an incredibly effective way to learn. And Germany has vocational schools for anything from engineering to nursing to secretaries. countries. Apprenticeships are primarily done in smaller businesses, and after finishing school, they are usually offered a job at the place where they trained. And this provides German students with two major advantages. The first is that a lot of employers want you to have several years of experience once you come out of college. In most countries, students don't have experience after leaving college and find it very difficult to find a job. Many of them are forced to find a job with a lower salary in a different industry because they can't find a job in time. But in Germany, this is usually not a problem, and youth unemployment has generally been lower in Germany compared to other countries. The second advantage is that you don't have a shortage or abundance of one type of student. If there are more people graduating medical schools than there are job openings for doctors and nurses, then a whole bunch of students spend years studying for nothing. But because Germany needs a lot of apprenticeships, the amount of students is limited by the amount the industry needs. The German workforce is therefore much better suited for the industry they are trying to find a job in, making the average German more efficient per hour of work than almost any other country in the world. By the way, this video is going up in March, so if you have to decide what to study next, maybe choose a vocational school. Most countries have them, just not as many as Germany. And stuff like an elevator mechanic, for example, pays a lot more than most university degrees, and doesn't take as long to complete. If this whole YouTube thing doesn't work out for me, that's what I might try to do. Alright, back to the video. Germany's economy grew steadily after World War II thanks to all these efforts I just mentioned. But by the 1970s, they started to have new issues. In the 1970s, Germany had a recession. In 1979 to 1980, there was an oil crisis, and then in the early 1980s, the government started to go bankrupt. You see, after World War II, almost all of Germany's debt was forgiven, and Germany could start borrowing all over again. But the more they borrowed, the more they would have to spend on repaying previous debt. Because they had suffered two crises in the 1970s, the government had less money that they could tax. To make up for this lack of money, they borrowed more, going from borrowing just 1.7% of the budget in the late 1970s to 4.9% in the early 80s. And the more they began borrowing, the less likely they were to repay their old debt, and the more expensive it became to borrow more money. To understand how this works, let's say you are an investor. You have 10 billion to spend and you decide to lend that money out to 10 different countries. You agree to give them 1 billion now and they agree to give you back 20% interest, meaning that they pay you back 200 million extra over the course of 12 months, meaning that you go from having 10 billion at the beginning of the year and 12 billion at the end of the year. But then it turns out that two of those countries are actually broke and can't repay their debt. So instead of getting $12 billion at the end of the year, you now only have 9.6, and you've just made a loss. So the next year you once again have 10 billion and try this again. But now you force them to pay 30% interest instead of 20%, so that if a country doesn't repay their debt, you don't lose any money. And the way it works in real life is that the more likely a country is to go bankrupt, the more they will have to pay interest. And the more Germany borrowed, the more likely they were to go bankrupt, and the higher the interest rates became, and the more money they would have to pay back every time they borrowed money. And so West Germany implemented a new policy called austerity. Under austerity, the government decreases expenditure. In the case of Germany, they decided to decrease the government budget by 2% per year in the 1980s until they reached a total reduction of 14%. This hurt the economy quite a bit, because if you sell to the government and then the government spends less money, you lose a major customer. And a lot of companies might go bankrupt or have to fire people to stay in business. And in 1985, the German economy had slowed down to just 0.3% economic growth. But as the government repaid more and more of its debt, more money was available each year, meaning that even though the government expenditure was 14% less, around 1/3 of that decrease was just because they didn't have to repay any extra debt anymore. This in turn made investors more confident that Germany could repay all of its loans, and so they demanded lower interest rates again because Germany was safer to invest in, meaning that by the late 1980s, Germany's finances were so good that they could borrow at a very low cost, meaning Germany would have more money available again without having to spend so much of the government budget on repaying old debt, and the money that they now saved could be spent on developing the nation. If you've ever wondered why Germany wants austerity measures in the EU, it's because it worked in their country to bring down interest rates and steady economic growth by the late 1980s. Chapter 9. Germany will be united. By the time West Germany recovered, the Cold War was ending. And at the end of the Cold War, East Germany and West Germany reunited again to form the Germany we know today. But combining two economies together is difficult. For example, each country had a different currency, social program, tax policy, and much more. They replaced the East German currency with the West German currency on July 1st, 1990. Then, West German laws replaced East German laws, and exactly 24 years ago today, on March 15th, 1991, East Germany joined West Germany as 5 new states: Brandenburg, Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Thuringia, bringing the total number of German states up to 16. Western Germany invested heavily in the eastern part, setting up new social programs, building up new infrastructure, and in general bringing living standards on par with the West. This cost roughly $2 trillion United States dollars. It cost that much money because after World War II, a lot of East Germany's industry and infrastructure was moved to the Soviet Union. East Germany therefore started in the 1950s with a major economic crisis. And under Soviet-style communism, economic growth was slower than in West Germany throughout the 70s and 80s. And by 1990, the average East German was only about 60% as wealthy as the average West German. While the East wasn't particularly poor, it wasn't particularly wealthy either. On top of that, a lot of things were done differently. Each side had a different train system, which often didn't connect. East German infrastructure was generally not well maintained. And if you look at this image on screen right now, you can see that even something as simple as streetlights use different lamps. In order to pay for all of these things, the new United Germany put an extra tax on people's income. The money from that tax would be directly invested in East Germany, but there is no fast way to develop an economy. And even now, 30 years later, Germany has spent over $2 trillion into Eastern Germany, and the East is still about 20% poorer than the West. It is likely that this economic development will still take many decades, meaning that if Germany doesn't make any major mistakes, it will be able to grow its economy for many years to come, because East Germany still has a lot of catching up to do. But because they spent so much money on the East, the West was neglected and stagnated. While the West wasn't doing poorly, they also weren't improving that much. And from 1990 to 1995, Germany as a whole went through an economic crisis trying to pay for East German development. But it also caused another migration wave, as people didn't want to wait decades and decades for the East to catch up, and so people from the eastern part began moving to the western part. In the western part of Germany, those people could usually do the same jobs but for a much better salary. And this caused the German economy to experience steady growth for much of the late 1990s and 2000s. Chapter 10. The European Leader. Before the European Union existed, there was the European Economic Community, and if you look on screen right now, you will see all the members of this community right before German reunification. At the time, there were 12 members. The 3 European leaders were France, the UK, and West Germany. They were the 3 largest economies in the European Economic Community, and they were roughly the same size. Then, German reunification happened, and suddenly the new German economy was becoming larger than the other 2. Then, in the late 1990s, the German economy recovered from the economic shock caused by reunification, and this resulted that in the 2000s, Germany emerged as a leading member of the European Union. And that leader had a big economic problem. Germany was now producing more goods than there were customers who could buy them. Germany focused mostly on expensive products, but only rich people can buy expensive products. So Germany came up with a strategy to lower the cost of production while also making new rich customers, expanding the European Union. After the collapse of the USSR and Yugoslavia, a lot of new countries were created in the Baltics, Central Europe and Balkans. If those countries joined the EU, then they could produce components at a lower price due to their lower wages. At the same time, Germany would invest hundreds of billions into Eastern Europe to lift them out of poverty, thereby creating more rich customers to buy German products. And so Germany pushed for expansion by convincing the rest of the EU to let in these 10 countries you see on screen right now in 2004, Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, and Croatia in 2013. By 2023, the EU had spent over €500 billion developing these new countries. Around 100 billion came from Germany, and this tactic was so effective that in the year 2020 alone, Germany traded for €197 billion with those Eastern European countries. Meaning that around every 6 months, Germany earns back all the money it has invested in 30 years. At the same time, in 2002, the euro was introduced. You see, when Germany wanted to reunify, they needed French support. That's because of certain treaties that were made after World War II. And in exchange, France wanted the euro. The reason for this is that the German currency was considered incredibly stable. Thanks to the austerity measures in the 80s and strict control over how much money the country could print and borrow, meant that the German currency did not lose a lot of value every year. Or in other words, inflation was low. But this was not the case for France. And so France and Germany could work together to create a shared currency. That currency would eventually be called the euro. By using the euro, countries gained two major advantages. The first is that it's easier to trade between two euro members. I can just go to Germany and spend Dutch euro coins there. I can look at German prices and immediately know how much everything costs instead of calculating prices in my head all the time. And if I need to pay someone who also uses euro, then I won't lose money converting that to another currency. The second advantage was mainly for countries with poorer finances, because they could replace a currency that wasn't very stable with the euro, which was stable. Because Germany used the euro, investors were almost certain that no matter how much they loaned out to a eurozone country, they would get their money back. And if you remember from earlier in this video, the more likely a country is to repay its debt, the less a country needs to pay extra in interest. And so, with lower interest rates, a lot of European countries suddenly began borrowing like crazy. And then, in 2008, the United States suffered a massive economic crisis. Germany and the rest of the EU do a lot of business with the US, causing an economic crisis in the EU as well. And when a country has an economic crisis, the government earns less in taxes. And when the government has less money, they can't pay for everything anymore. And in the case of countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, they became unable to repay that debt. And they owed a lot of that debt to investors and banks inside the EU. If one of those countries went bankrupt, those investment companies and banks would go bankrupt as well. That means a lot less investment and people losing all of their savings if it is their bank going under. This would then cause more and more countries to go bankrupt as well, and in the end, the entire European economy would come crumbling down. This is the danger of sharing your currency with another country. And a lot of countries which did not borrow that much money were just a little bit upset that their economies were going to suffer because of the mistakes of another country. But there was only truly one solution. Someone would have to give money to those failing countries or else everybody would go bankrupt. And there was only really one country in the EU with enough finances to prop up the failing governments. Germany. But those Germans have a tradition of careful financing. In the 1980s, Germany had fixed its finances. The way they saw it, why should we, Germans, have to pay for another country's debt when they were borrowing way more than they should have? And so Germany, the only country capable of saving the euro and Europe's economy, made a deal. Germany, along with every other eurozone country with stable finances, would loan money to Southern Europe and Ireland. But in exchange, the EU would have to implement austerity, just as Germany had done in the 1980s. And this marked a major shift for Germany, because suddenly Germany had become so powerful that it could dictate economic policy to other EU members. And while this strategy brought down the cost of borrowing across Eurozone countries, it also helped the German economy a lot. That's because under austerity the government spends less money. Companies that sell to the government therefore go bankrupt and people lose their income. And in a lot of EU countries, the economy suffered a lot from austerity. But Germany did not have this problem. It was one of the few countries who had their government finances really well in order. They did not need to reduce government spending as much as France, Greece or Spain, for example. And German industry replaced a lot of businesses who went bankrupt in other EU countries. At the same time, Eastern Europe did not have the euro yet, and therefore did not suffer as much from the euro crisis. Germany is positioned close to those countries, and they began selling more and more stuff to Eastern Europe as they became richer. As a result, Germany's economy just kept growing and growing in the late 2000s and the 2010s.